Milling Through History presents Mr. McMahon, a review of the Netflix documentary. Last week, Netflix released the long-anticipated documentary series entitled Mr. McMahon. This biographical documentary series examined the life and business dealings of Vince McMahon, the genius behind turning professional wrestling from a carnival attraction to a billion-dollar industry. Fans of wrestling who have watched the series have since come out against it, claiming that Netflix decided to create a hit piece designed to tarnish the name of McMahon. Casual fans of wrestling were stunned by what they learned and how ruthless the business mogul was. However, can these fans offer a real analysis of a documentary focusing on the life of a person from his historical lens? The answer is no. The biases brought into the show immediately present themselves, as seen in the final episode when Bruce Pritchard lambasts some of the early episodes he saw in a sneak peek of the series. So who can give an honest analysis of the program? Enter the historians. With an objective eye, we will look into the series and decide whether or not the program is an unbiased source for history, or if it was a hit piece aimed at smearing the name of Vince McMahon. Chris Smith, the man who produced the documentary series Tiger King, helped to produce and also direct the McMahon documentary. As a person who did not have any interest in wrestling, his ability to go into a subject matter without any bias as to the people involved helped lay out a narrative which remained focused on the subject matter which the series was based on. However, because he was not a wrestling fan, this greatly limited the final product of the series, as it meant there may have been aspects of the industry discussed in the interviews which were left on the cutting room floor because he did not know of the importance of some topics. For instance, how was Vince McMahon going to run his business in the early 1990s if he found himself going to prison during his IRS trial? Or, alternatively, how was Vince McMahon able to use his clout to ensure other competing wrestling promotions could not compete with his, at the time named, WWF? Or perhaps, exactly what extent did Vince McMahon and the McMahon family have when it came to politics? Briefly, this documentary touched on the fact that Linda McMahon was in the Trump cabinet, but never once did it mention her two failed bids for the Senate and how much of a political activist she and the McMahon family are. Thankfully, the topics about Vince McMahon's early business dealings have been touched upon in numerous WWE DVD documentaries over the years, and his ruthless rise to power is well discussed and examined in the series, such as The Rise and Fall of WCW, Mid-South, The Amazing History of the AWA, and ECW. In fact, one of the most common traits that was heard is how Vince McMahon tried to poach wrestlers from opposing companies during the 1980s, only to have it done to himself in the 1990s. And even today, Vince McMahon will still look for talent from outside companies, and even now, the new heads of the company continue to do such things. Apparently, sometimes going to the same playbook does work, depending on who you are. One criticism garnered about the series was the lack of contributions McMahon made to charitable organizations and society as a whole. While this is true, there should be some context applied to this claim. Now, Vince McMahon certainly influenced professional football, and while some folks might immediately say, how does the XFL have any impact on football, you'd be amazed. Prior to the creation of the XFL, watching football games was rather bland and dry. Wide-angle camera lenses were used, perhaps some tight shots on the sidelines. But Vince McMahon brought in better camera angles, including the use of a camera on a zip line over the entire length of the field, allowing for closer views of the plays that would track players, especially within the midfield. Not surprisingly, the NFL would take all the good ideas McMahon had for the XFL, along with all of his good players. But in the season following the debut of the XFL, never once does the NFL ever acknowledge that some of the things that they were incorporating were brought specifically from a rival organization. Now, as for charity groups, the WWE did have a strong working relationship with organizations such as Make-A-Wish, the Susan G. Komen Foundation, and Connor's Cure, just to name a few. However, Vince McMahon having any direct influence with these organizations is a stretch from the imagination, as the person really in charge of trying to reach out and create and foster a relationship between the WWE and these charity groups was the brand officer. And the brand officer at this time was Stephanie McMahon. Now, by attempting to sway the direction and focus of the person responsible for creating more positive aspects towards the WWE away from Stephanie and over towards Vince, certainly is trying to rewrite and retell the tale of history. And as such, critics who say, well, Vince did all these things, no, it wasn't McMahon, just not Vince McMahon. Perhaps one of the most difficult topics to talk about in the DVD series would be that of Owen Hart and Chris Benoit. Both men's deaths were addressed in the Netflix series, and while Owen's death was a horrible, tragic accident, Benoit's was one which certainly does not make Vince McMahon or famed wrestler Stone Cold Steve Austin look very positive. The death of Chris Benoit was a tragic event, namely because no one actually thought the man would ever commit suicide. Initial reports of his death led many wrestling fans to believe that whoever went in there had to have killed him first, then brutally murdered his wife and young son. Instead, an autopsy revealed that Chris Benoit suffered from a neurological condition called CTE, which led to the deaths of the three members of the family. Now, the trauma Benoit received to his brain was attributed to years of headbutts, chair shots, and over-the-top dives. And as such, doctors pinpointed that because of so much trauma to his brain, Benoit, who was only in his mid-40s at the time, had the brain of a man who was closer to his 80s and almost 90 years old. Now, Vince McMahon, in defense of his own leadership of the company at the time, said that any stunts that Benoit was doing were staged, and as a professional, he knew how to protect himself and make it look good while not getting hurt. And yet, going one step further with this was Stone Cold Steve Austin, who had said that throughout the length of his entire career, he had only suffered one concussion, and that if a wrestler was continuously getting concussions, clearly this person was not working very safe. However, only just a little prior to Austin making this unbelievable claim, both Hulk Hogan and The Undertaker had stated in interviews that they had dealt with numerous injuries in the course of working professional wrestling, and that they themselves had to deal with numerous surgeries. In which case, if all these stunts are being done specifically to protect the person doing it, why is it men who are doing things that are less dangerous than Chris Benoit still walk away from the ring needing surgeries? Clearly something does not add up here. Ironically enough, even Stone Cold Steve Austin would suffer a near-fatal injury in the ring and a concussion, both in the same match. Now, one of the things that certainly shows itself in this particular segment, though, of this Netflix series is the fact that older generations do not necessarily respond very well to new medical research that comes out. The vehement denial of CTE and the effects that trauma to the head can have from Vince McMahon and Steve Austin shows that clearly there's not something there. And it's not as if this isn't unheard of. We have seen in the past how, when it came to war, shell shock was seen as just plain cowardice. And in fact, post-traumatic stress disorder was also seen as just being losing your nerves. Instead, neurological conditions and psychological conditions are still something that is rarely ever addressed, especially in men. And as such, we see here that if there is a hit piece, it's simply that the director showed the unfortunate biases of outdated understanding and education as compared to new up-to-date, in which case we can certainly attribute this to generational gap issues, but not necessarily a direct hit piece on Vince McMahon as it is just industry standards. Now, the problem is that when it comes to professional wrestling, people are still going to get hurt. It's a fact of life. There's nothing they can do about it. And yet, the director could have gone into more detail with regards to how the WWE initiated new policies and guidelines to protect their wrestlers. In this respect, Chris Smith definitely dropped the ball. One of the best examples of showing just how much WWE has changed occurred in 2015 with their reality series of Tough Enough. During the series, individuals who were trying to earn a spot in the WWE roster, if they were found to have any medical conditions, for instance, heart murmurs, this would immediately disqualify them, mainly because the company was not going to do anything to put their lives and their bodies at risk. And so, even today, protocol states that after a long program, a wrestler gets some time off in order to allow their body to heal. Chair shots are greatly limited. Any stunt that involves injury potentially to the head is going to be reviewed, and in some cases, matches will be stopped. Even today, in the middle of matches, if a wrestler appears to suffer a concussion, it's stopped, and they are immediately going under concussion protocol. As such, Vince McMahon might not necessarily have believed in the idea of CTE, but he was able to institute a new resounding method of ensuring that if there is any issue with concussions, he wasn't about to allow anyone else to deal with the consequences. Now, the biggest scandal, though, was the issue of sex. During the 1980s, there was a scandal revolving around a female referee, and for those who have studied professional wrestling and have looked at the darker side of the WWE, there were even reports about McMahon having a sexual scandal with a female ring announcer. In the 1990s, McMahon even admitted to having an affair in an interview conducted by Playboy magazine. And during the 2000s, sexual harassment lawsuits were filed against him. And eventually, these lawsuits would come back to haunt him as new sexual allegations were put against him, including sex trafficking. Now, when it comes to the scandal, though, the last 30 minutes of the documentary are undeniably the most damning towards McMahon. But the one person whose career was probably hurt even more from those 30 minutes, not necessarily Vince McMahon, but that of Brock Lesnar. Now, Brock Lesnar had his name directly tied to McMahon's, as McMahon having been accused of sex trafficking, and Brock Lesnar being the individual responsible for connected with the whole trafficking issues. Namely, he was willing to accept sexual favors as a method for him to agree to come back on to WWE television. Now, for Vince McMahon, his pattern of misogynistic behavior for almost 40 years was well documented, namely through the way in which he treated female wrestlers in the 1980s and early 1990s, to the way he treated them into the late 90s into the 2000s, and even his on-air character of Mr. McMahon, willingly going out first to humiliate women, then to sexualize them, and effectively make it appear as if he just didn't care whatsoever. Now, Vince McMahon might say that's not who he is, and yet, even throughout the series, he acknowledges sex is on his brain almost all the time. He has a belief that he is better than other people, and as such, what we see on TV is really just him, with the volume cranked all the way up. But how is it Vince McMahon was able to get away with all this for so long? Well, the answer is ironically enough tied to the industry that he has made famous. For years, people have always assumed professional wrestling is fake, and therefore anyone involved with it clearly must be working some kind of angle. There has to be a camera somewhere. It's all part of the show. It's fake. Which means any woman that ever comes out screaming about rape or sexual assault or anything like that, society believes, well, they're part of the wrestling show. It has to be part of the show. No one takes them seriously. And as a result, Vince McMahon basically had a free pass from the society at large because people underestimated the fact that there is a line between fact and fiction. And that line needs to always be respected. So is the Mr. McMahon documentary a hit piece against Vince McMahon? Well, the answer is no. Die-hard wrestling fans who claim it is seem to forget that all of the McMahon controversies have been well documented even by WWE with their own documentary series on DVD, now even found on demand. This is all there. In fact, if anything, not enough was done by Netflix to go into every aspect of McMahon's career. As such, one can certainly argue it's not a hit piece. For the casual fan who is stunned, really? Are you stunned? If you've paid attention to anything about Vince McMahon and the way he is on camera, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that this is the kind of person he is off camera. But is it a good source of history? Well, probably not. If anything, the stories being told certainly are enlightening. Are they entertaining? Most assuredly. Do they paint professional wrestling in a bad light? Well, that's subject to determination. But one of the things that is important to note is that come 2025, Netflix and WWE will have a brand new working relationship, as the old flagship program of Monday Night Raw will transition from cable television to streaming service. Now, why would Netflix do this? Well, in some ways, it could be a symbolic gesture. The Mr. McMahon documentary series was produced partially by WWE, but it was finished when WWE found itself under new ownership, namely the TKO Group. This group, since the resignation of Vince McMahon from the WWE Board of Directors, has been quietly working behind the scenes, letting go of former Vince McMahon employees, specifically those who were higher up. If the Netflix documentary is guilty of being anything, it is not a hit piece against McMahon, but rather a declaration of independence, namely, citing the fact that this is how WWE became the global juggernaut that it is, but its leader lost his way, as paraphrased by Eric Young, TNA superstar. As such, because Netflix is working with TKO and not Vince McMahon, they can effectively say the McMahon chapter of professional wrestling is over, and a new chapter of professional wrestling has just begun.
For more information, please consider these suggested titles. Be sure to click on the left-hand side of the screen to subscribe to our show, and on the right-hand side for our latest episode. And we will see you again for the next episode of Milling Through History.